Hello and welcome to another edition of the Mediatwits. I'm Mark Glaser, Executive Editor of PBS MediaShift. This week we'll be talking about a Newsweek cover story, Newsweek coming back in print, revealing the founder of Bitcoin as Dorian Sakamoto. But was it really the founder? A lot of questions abound about the story. Social media and the Bitcoin community was on fire, saying that Dorian, the person that was found as the founder of Bitcoin, is not really the founder, and that there's a lot of doubt on the story. We'll talk a lot about that story, and then we'll also talk a little bit about South by Southwest conference happening in Austin. The interactive part just wrapped up, and we'll talk a little bit about South by Southwest taking kind of a political angle this year and talking about data and privacy and kind of the contradiction of South by Southwest in bringing in speakers decrying privacy while also talking a lot about analytics and companies and marketers that are gathering data. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well. First, I want to introduce our panel. We have Andrew Lih from American University joining us. We have our Mediatwits managing producer, Fannie Cohen, joining us. And we have Stephanie Murphy from Let's Talk Bitcoin joining us, a popular podcast on Bitcoins itself. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about Bitcoins for people who don't know. It's a cryptographic currency, or a virtual currency that literally lets people send money to anywhere in the world to other people using encryption and kind of avoiding all the kind of international transfer fees and banking fees. And there's a limited amount of Bitcoins in circulation. And the price and value of Bitcoins has fluctuated wildly, going up extremely high, and then lately there's been a lot of fraud and theft and a lot of allegations of issues and problems and technical problems with the currency. But through it all, there's been this kind of shadowy person who helped start Bitcoin, Satoshi Nakamoto, or at least that's his name or her name. Online, the question has always been, who is this person? They never really came out and said who they were. And so Newsweek, coming back in print, has this really splashy article saying that it's, found the founder of Bitcoin, this kind of scruffy older Asian guy who his name actually was Satoshi Nakamoto, but Nakamoto, sorry, and but his changed his name to Dorian at one point. And there were some things that were very similar about him. He has a background in computing, and he's very secretive. His family says there's a large part of his work kind of history that is just blank. No one really knows a lot about him. I'm curious, Stephanie, what did you think about this story? I know the Bitcoin community has pretty much slammed the story, as have all journalism people. What was the reaction, your personal reaction, just the reaction of people kind of in the Bitcoin community to this story?
Well, first, Mark, I want to say you mentioned there was a lot of fraud and theft recently with Bitcoin. You could certainly say the same thing about credit cards and cash. I mean, for everything that people say about Bitcoin, that it's the shadowy underworld, a lot of the same stuff happens in the legacy financial system. And, personally, if I had created such a disruptive technology like Bitcoin, I would probably want to keep my privacy too, because there would be a lot of people who wouldn't like that, especially people in power, and they would want to come after me. So I certainly don't blame Satoshi, whoever he, she, or they is, for wanting to be private. So I think the Bitcoin community really is kind of falling down in the camp of leave Satoshi alone, right? Satoshi gave the world this great gift, which is Bitcoin, and just wants to be left alone. So why don't we do that, right? I was very skeptical of this article when it first came out. Satoshi has, we have email correspondence from Satoshi. Satoshi has a PGP key that they could have sent an email from and signed. There's multiple other ways that Satoshi could have come out and said, yes, this is me, and had it be credible and verifiable, but none of those happened.
And so you think that that the story, there's just not enough evidence in the story to really link it to this guy Dorian. But no matter who Newsweek unmasked, whether it was true or not true, I'm guessing the Bitcoin community would have been upset either way.
Well, there probably could have been some of that. I'm sure there are people who are very curious who Satoshi is because, as human beings, we are very curious. But, this is kind of coincident with Newsweek going back into print. They needed to have a big story. Mainstream media kind of fighting for relevancy now in a world where blogs and digital media is really taking the front stage. So I don't blame people for getting a little bit upset and saying, they're just trying to kind of promote themselves. And this guy, Dorian, was kind of put on the chopping block, and his privacy really, really sacrificed.
Yeah. And what do you think, Andrew, about this story and just what it says about kind of the journalism of Newsweek at this point? That maybe they're after the controversy. Maybe they knew that they had something that was very controversial and that would bring a lot of page views and a lot of views to the story, but maybe they went with something that they shouldn't have, and it wasn't as Felix Salmon, who couldn't join us this week. I mean, he had some amazing analysis of this. Said that the idea that this is really Dorian is probably somewhere between 10 and 90% chance, and so really it should have been presented more as a theory than as an actual fact.
Right. I do wish that Felix was with us, but he's on vacation, probably well-earned vacation. As you said, he had two of the biggest or most widely circulated critiques of this Newsweek piece, and I think they were both excellent. One was calling into question the way that it was brought about, and then secondly, spending after 2 hours with Leah McGrath Goodman on the phone and getting quotes from her to get more details on this. And I think that's something that a lot of folks were disturbed by, is that it wasn't completely transparent in what was found during the reporting, and she came up with some conclusions that you weren't really clear on what that whole audit trail was to the story. I'm going to take the weird paradoxical stance of, I absolutely believe that this is a newsworthy story. I believe there is a public interest in trying to find out who is the person or persons. So for the longest time, a lot of the folks in the tech and Bitcoin community think that this is more likely than not to be a collective of folks, because the knowledge needed to create not only a system, but to know the math and the crypto, and to have the experience in creating something that when you launch it is kind of bulletproof as a currency, takes a lot of expertise. So for someone, an individual, to have all the needed skills to do this, this person must be someone who really knows the crypto literature, is well-versed in coding, and the more you look at it, Dorian S. Nakamoto in Southern California is not that guy. And when I first read this story, some things did not pass the smell test for me. So even in the first page, number one was when she related the story of how the Temple City, California cops were coming to the house, and the reporter pointed out, this is Satoshi Nakamoto, and immediately in the prose of the piece, a police officer said, that's the creator of Bitcoin, and immediately that didn't pass the smell test. There's a lot of geeks out there who don't even know who Satoshi Nakamoto is, so you're telling me a police officer would. And the second thing was her implication that it's really odd or unbelievable that this guy would, retreat to the foothills of the San Gabriel Valley and be in Temple City. Now, I used to live like 10 minutes north of Temple City. This is actually not an unusual place to live. It's like 35% Asian. It is a really nice place to live. And on top of that, a lot of the circumstantial evidence about, he had this job that he couldn't talk about because it was classified, and he was a contractor who couldn't reveal these secrets. That's not unusual for Southern California either. My brother works for a company. I don't really know what he does. He's worked 10 years for a military contractor. So it's not really
Bitcoin is what you're trying to say.
I know. I'm saying that my brother is a decent candidate for being the Bitcoin creator, which I'm not convinced he is. So those all kind of raise some really suspicious things for me. And then the interview for Business Insider with a so-called expert, Sharon Sargent, that Lee McGrath Goodman used, just made a slam dunk case for me that this was not a good story, and the facts were off on this whole thing. So some of the things that really the techie community honed in on after the interview with Sharon Sargent just said, you did not, as a reporter, this is for Leah McGrath Goodman, pick a very good person to collaborate with. So the one that just kind of jumped out at everyone, I think Stephanie can confirm this in terms of the tech side of things. The one quote that the so-called expert Sharon Sargent had with Business Insider said, the idea of conserving any kind of resources are very, very old-time concerns. This is an elaboration on a quote that was in a Newsweek piece saying, it was really odd for Satoshi Nakamoto in the Bitcoin paper to worry about disk space, because disk space is cheap. No one cares about disk space today. That's complete craziness. One of the biggest concerns in the Bitcoin community today is the fact that since every transaction is logged in Bitcoin, you have to carry around a 1.7 gigabyte log of all the Bitcoin transactions. That's a huge concern about scalability. People aren't even sure that Bitcoin can live, for another 5-10 years if you have to carry around all that data. So for this forensic expert to say that space is no concern, I'm not sure why Satoshi Nakamoto wrote about this, is crazy. So this is something that just was kind of the final nail in the coffin, saying this piece is really badly researched, the evidence is not there, and it's just really unbelievable that this is the right person that Goodman has fingered.
So to defend Goodman, obviously she's not here right now. She says she does have some evidence that she's dug up that convinces her that Dorian is Satoshi, but she says she can't share it publicly. That's one thing. Another thing is the way that this guy has reacted. She kind of contacted him about model trains. That's what he was trading in. He was really into. And the moment she brought up Bitcoin, he just kind of stopped the conversation. And similarly, when she went and confronted him in person, he had this kind of "I'm not involved with it anymore" type thing. I mean, if someone really had nothing to do with Bitcoin, first he says he doesn't know anything about Bitcoin, and then he says he stopped having anything to do with it. It just seems a little odd. There's definitely some strange things about this guy, that he had this kind of disappeared from society. His family didn't really even know what he did. Like you said, there's a lot of people with that. But his reactions were a little bit strange for someone who either didn't have anything to do with Bitcoin or knew about it and wasn't involved. It's just his reaction seemed very strange.
If you believe what she wrote in the piece is a pretty good transcription or relaying of what actually happened in her interaction. But I'm not clear on that at all, because that initial exchange with the police officers about him being the founder of Bitcoin, it was revealed later on that that was actually an abridged version of what happened, but it was written up in a more dramatic way. So I'm not sure I trust most of the other things in the article as written as being an accurate log of what happened.
And Elise,
we need a video. We need a video
go ahead, Stephanie.
I think we need a video to be able to believe that. I'm very skeptical of that. And I mean, she stalked him, okay? I mean, if you had someone in your driveway who was following you around, I don't know about you, but I would probably try to say anything that would get them to go away and leave.
Possibly. And Elise, who's joining us now from NPR, thanks for coming on as well.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, sorry to be late.
That's okay. We understand in the world of news that happens. So tell us, what's your thought about how this story played out for Newsweek? I mean, do you think there were some real journalistic malfeasance? Should this have been done more in the open? I know that Felix Salmon has said, hey, they should have been just an investigation done by the community. Why didn't they do it that way? Why is it done in this kind of old-fashioned, we came up with the truth in our own kind of behind-the-scenes way?
Well, I think the answer to that is simple, because Newsweek was relaunching as a print magazine, right? And it wanted to have a big scoop for its relaunch. And secondly, the crowd has been searching for Satoshi Nakamoto for years. I mean, or there has been a crowd sort of generated Reddit-like search for the identity behind the man or woman or group. What I think is interesting is that this moment for Newsweek, I mean, it's getting so much attention. Everybody is citing this particular reporter, and the name Newsweek is back sort of in the media zeitgeist again. So is all publicity good publicity in this case, even though there are numerous holes in the reporting, but I feel like we on this podcast are going to be the ones, or sort of people who are particularly interested in journalism or the business of journalism are going to have these sorts of conversations in our narrow field, but in the wider universe, Newsweek's name is just being tossed around. So I'm kind of interested to see how well this plays for a brand that had been suffering and dormant and is now back.
Yeah, I mean, how important is it now for journalistic brands? You'd think it was more important than ever to build trust and credibility because there's so many other sources out there. And so, would Newsweek take a real hit because if eventually we find out it was not the person they've unmasked and it's someone else or it's a group or they've really got it wrong, that seems like that would matter and that people might not pay attention to them as much, or is credibility kind of elastic now because everyone makes mistakes? I wonder.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Fannie.
I'll jump in and say that for me, Felix's problem is the way that it was presented. That if she had told the narrative of how they arrived at Dorian, and because it is mysterious and because she is withholding something that the implication is that if this information is somewhat dangerous, is why else would she be holding on to it if it could make her case, because she's in the crosshairs now. So I think that if it was presented in a different way, that people would be having a different reaction to it, because it is this caper that people are trying to unravel.
Andrew, what were you going to say about Newsweek?
Yeah, I think what Elise said is true. I mean, for Newsweek, the most important thing is they're back in the conversation, whether it's because it's good news or bad news or good reporting or bad reporting. We hadn't really talked about Newsweek at all, except being, in the past, this little appendage of Daily Beast. But when this story came out, everyone said, who owns Newsweek now? And suddenly we found out, oh, International Business Times. I didn't realize that. And so in that respect, it got a lot more people aware of what they're doing now, even if we think at least we're going to find ultimately this story was incorrect.
But it was at the expense, again, of this older gentleman who didn't ask for that to happen and probably didn't want that to happen. And I mean, Newsweek got a lot of publicity out of it, but at someone else's expense, frankly. I mean, there have been other people who have been accused and fingered as Satoshi, but none of the mainstream outlets have jumped on them and done pieces on them. It's all been bloggers, and you just didn't hear about that stuff.
Yeah, and it seems like a lot of people are criticizing Newsweek over, putting the picture of his house in the story, and people finding where his home exactly is and his license plate and all these things. That seems like it's going a little bit far too. I mean, it seems like there could be grounds for maybe some sort of lawsuit if they really caused some sort of harm to this guy if he didn't really have anything to do with Bitcoin.
Yeah, I mean, that's what's interesting is because the enthusiasts of Bitcoin tend to be your techies, your internet geeks, your hacker types. There is an ethos in that community of respecting people's, desire for privacy. And what's ironic is that the people who probably would be most interested in finding out who he is have the most respect for not going down that road in an aggressive way. Yet here you have Newsweek, taking advantage of that situation to make a name for itself in an era where we've kind of forgotten about their brand. So that's, there are a lot of people who pointed to the parallels with the Grantland Dr. V magical putter story, where that resulted in a really bad situation at the end, where going and digging through all the personal details led to a really a bad outcome in that sense. So I hope that doesn't happen in this Newsweek story. It doesn't seem like it is, but it just puts a lot of doubt into people's minds about the ethics of journalists when they dig into the personal lives of folks like this.
And speaking of privacy and digging into personal lives and surveillance, let's switch and talk a little bit about South by Southwest, because one of the biggest speakers there was Edward Snowden, kind of coming in through, I think it was a Google Hangout of some sort, from Russia, and he spoke to the audience there and talked about how, the people at South by Southwest are the people who can really change. The NSA has basically set the internet on fire, and the firefighters are the people at South by Southwest. There was also a talk from Julian Assange as well, and it seemed like it had a very kind of political bent, especially kind of against surveillance and for privacy in a way. Elise, you were at South by. What was your take on just that kind of angle? I mean, were those kind of the big highlights, bringing in people like Julian Assange and Ed Snowden, or were there other highlights that you saw or heard when you were there?
Well, the topic of privacy was sort of the major theme at South by, whether it was whether it was consumer facing when we talked about wearable gadgets, or whether it was about government and surveillance. So, and I reported this pretty extensively on Monday for NPR, just that South by Southwest has always involved a number of marketing bonanzas and party shenanigans and things like that. But programming-wise, this year it definitely took a harder edge turn to privacy, to surveillance topics. And in part, or largely in part, because of what we've learned about government surveillance over the course of Snowden's leaks in 2013. And so definitely a harder edge turn that we saw. Snowden was well received by that crowd. He was simulcast in 3 major rooms that could seat anywhere between 2,000 to 5,000 people at once, in the largest one. And this was kind of the ideal crowd for him. It wasn't hardcore cryptographers or hackers that you might see at another conference, but there were the hardcore hackers among the group. And it was big enough that he could reach digitally savvy people, people who are aware that we are constantly sharing our data, that his talk wouldn't be over anyone's heads. So it was sort of the ideal mix of the masses and specific talents in the tech field. And so even though the government says that he's really putting a lot of Americans at risk by being in Russia and his information being, or his hard drives possibly being open to access by Russians, the crowd there received him fairly well.
And what about, this, there's a story in Fortune by Aaron Griffin March saying it's South by Southwest big ugly contradiction, that it was, highlighting these people who talk about surveillance and privacy, and yet you go into a party and you sign away basically your personal information to get a free doodad or app or something. I mean, really, a lot of the social media firms and tech firms that are there are really kind of using a lot of personal information to serve things and to really use your data in different ways. Did you kind of feel that contradiction when you were there at all?
Well, that's a huge theme in technology and culture coverage generally, right? That in order for us to sort of have more convenience in our lives, we're trading away our data, and so we've become essentially the products that these companies can sell to advertisers or marketers, right? So that came up a lot, but this is the crowd that South by Southwest has a attendance of something like 30,000, and this is the crowd that is going to be most willing to do that, right? Because it is sort of game to early adopt into these location-based social networks and whatnot. And so, yeah, this contradiction continues to occur, but I think we're going to see that not just at the conference, but in society overall.
Yeah, and Stephanie, you were down in Austin for a Bitcoin conference, and then the beginning of South by. What was just the feeling down there? I mean, it seemed like it's just getting bigger and bigger and hard to kind of grasp in a way. I mean, you can go to certain things, but it feels just hard to. I don't know if it's not hard to get something done, but it just seems very big, and to some people it's over now.
Yeah, Austin was packed. I was there for the Texas Bitcoin conference. I did catch a little bit of South by Southwest, but it was huge, and honestly, for all the buzz that Bitcoin has had over the past year or even more, it's still a young field. South by Southwest was not about Bitcoin. Maybe in a couple of years it will be, or it will be more about Bitcoin, but we've got a long way to go in terms of mainstream adoption.
And that might not be the point of Bitcoin. One conversation that we have is that we in the press keep saying, like, well, when will Bitcoin become a thing mainstream, and when will it be easier to trade in Bitcoin? When the folks at the very beginning of Bitcoin were ostensibly using it to avoid mainstream, ways of transferring money and buying and purchasing goods. And so maybe we're asking the wrong question, is what I'm trying to say.
But it is going mainstream, and it is getting easier, which I think benefits everybody, right? I mean, there are multiple different reasons why someone might use cash or a credit card or any type of payment method, and same thing with Bitcoin. There was a lot of focus at this conference that I was on as Bitcoin for a tool for good. So we talked a lot about Bitcoin charity and microlending and some of these other applications of Bitcoin that I think really are going to launch it into the mainstream.
I'm curious what you guys think about Bitcoin being used for paywalls. I know the Chicago Sun-Times had this experiment where I think it went to charity, but people could pay through Bitcoins in order to get access to their site. We've talked about micropayments for God knows how long, and they've always been difficult, but it seems like micropayments are more possible with Bitcoins just because you can go down to such a minute amount of money. I mean, do you see more potential around paywalls, Stephanie?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's no other. If you're trying to get past a paywall with, for instance, a credit card, nobody wants to type in all their information just to send a 25-cent payment or $1 payment or something like that. And that information can be stolen too. So there's a security issue with it. With Bitcoin, you just send a payment and you're through the paywall, and that's it. And actually, interestingly enough, the Chicago Sun-Times, I believe, they let people sort of pay what they want, and they were able to have some price discovery there where they discovered how much people were willing to pay to see their content, and what they came out with was 25 cents per article. So that's an interesting fact. Now, if you tried to send 25 cents with PayPal or with a credit card, there's going to be a 3% fee. I think PayPal's fees are 3% plus 30 cents, so you couldn't even really do that. Bitcoin definitely makes it so much more frictionless and easier to send small payments.
Do you see potential there, Andrew?
I think there is, but Bitcoin is still notoriously hard to use. And then the collapse of folks like Mt. Gox, the largest exchange on there, is definitely going to put a question mark in the minds of folks who were thinking of experimenting with this, but say, oh my gosh, if I'm holding it somewhere that's not on my mobile and somewhere out there, how am I going to trust the system, right? So I think even for folks who are pretty tech savvy, it's a little bit complicated in terms of using this on a day-to-day basis. But I think something like Bitcoin, if it's not Bitcoin itself, is part of our future in a major way. Whether it's Dogecoin or Mazacoin or all the other types of coins that are coming around, I think this is definitely part of our future in some major way.
And finally, Elise, just anything that you saw at South by that kind of surprised you or excited you more than the norm?
Well, I got to take a photo with that success kid, from the baby that goes like this, the internet meme. That was a lot of fun.
How old is he now?
He's like 5 or 6. I mean, he's grown up. No, I'm really, and I covered this towards the end, but I'm really excited. There seems to be a growth of interest in programmers and techies generally, and sort of the tech industry. Show business is kind of taking interest in it, and so there's actually 2 television shows that are coming out with programmers as the main characters. Mike Judge of Office Space and Beavis and Butthead fame is about to launch Silicon Valley, which I got to screen at South by Southwest, and that's going to come out on HBO. But Mad Men, the AMC is searching for the next Mad Men, and their offering in this realm is going to be a show about early 80s programmers and the early PC race to try and beat the IBM, which is really geeky, but that show called A Halt and Catch Fire, which is an early command for a PC, is coming out in June. And so there's kind of this interest culturally in techies and the tech world, and I think that's kind of exciting as somebody who watches it.
Yeah, and we've seen a lot of that in the past, but you're right. It does feel like we've come to a point now where programmers, techies, this world has, grown to such an extent that it has become part of the mainstream. And I mean, the discussion here in San Francisco, where I live, is so much about the tech people, to the point where they've gone from being the geeks to becoming kind of overlords of the city who should be spat upon, and rich should be thrown to their Google buses and everything. So it's a very bizarre turn of events here in San Francisco, and I think in a lot of other places where kind of techies have this strange. What was a little bit of that in Austin, just with the tech people there and maybe the locals who kind of getting tired of them?
Oh yeah, I mean, locally there was an advertising agency that's based in Austin that actually created an app called Avoid Humans, and it was for locals to try and avoid the crowds of South by Southwest. So it would use location data to figure out where people weren't, to offer places for locals to go. And so yeah, there definitely is that sort of fatigue, but that happens every year, and the South by organizer actually said that he was trying to hold down attendance levels this year so that it wasn't growing any bigger than what it's reached.
It's a good thing to try. to do. So thanks everyone for joining us. I want to thank Andrew Lih from American University, Elise Hu from NPR, Stephanie Murphy from Let's Talk Bitcoin, Fannie Cohen, our managing producer of the Mediatwits, and we'll catch you each and every week on Friday for another episode of the Mediatwits from PBS MediaShift at pbs.org/mediashift. We'll catch you next week.